Ladies and gentlemen, you have a real treat coming up because the absolutely amazing Andy Kaufman, who is, by the way, not just the host of People and Projects podcast, he's actually taught me an awful lot about what it means to be relaxed and at the same time be professional. I watch him, I listen to him. You should too. But that's not the only thing that he does. He also makes a point of helping leaders understand their ability and their responsibilities to lead and deliver, not just to sit, but to participate actively in the leadership of their teams. He's also the author of 3 books, and may I say, just between us kids, one of the most interesting guys on LinkedIn because he flat out refuses to let expectations drive what he finds interesting and what he thinks that the people who follow him would be interested in. So, thank you so much, Andy, for being here.
Oh,
Um,
Kimmy, I'm so glad. Thank you for the invitation.
well, we're going to dive right in. We use the term stakeholder all the time, and sometimes people don't realize who their real stakeholders are.
Mm.
Um, what kind of issue have you found that that creates for folks?
Well, yeah, I think often when I use the term or I hear people talk about it, they're talking about people outside the project team. So it's stakeholders, like people who were creating something for that we're going to deliver to, they're going to receive it. And certainly it's fair to say those are stakeholders. But some people love the Pinbot Guide, some people hate the Pinbot Guide. But I think the definition of a stakeholder in the Pinbot Guide, I think is really helpful. It's, who are those people who are going to be impacted by the project? So that's part of it, because they are going to be impacted by it, which is kind of consistent with that first part that we were talking about. But also, who could impact us? Now, those could easily be the same sort of people, but we often don't think of those people. Like, who are those people that are going to impact us? And then the third part of the PMI's definition is people that perceive they're going to be impacted. Maybe they're not, but they're still freaking out. And so we need to think about those. So by that definition, it casts the net pretty widely. And I think it's helpful to think about that. Who are going to impact? Because we're probably impacting more people than we realize. Who can impact us in a good way or bad way? Make it easier for us or make it more difficult. And who's out there that's worried and they don't need to be, and maybe we can take care of that if we manage those expectations and concerns early enough. So I really find that that's helpful to think in those terms.
I like that last one in particular because when people are operating from fear, it can get pretty weird along all sorts of lines. Now, our summit focuses on leadership, and right about now, there might be a person or two saying, well, wait a minute. If there are stakeholders, what has leadership got to do with it? But I want to ask you, what's an example of how we can lead stakeholders and lead with stakeholders who actually don't necessarily report to us?
Yeah. A lot of times we think of leadership as, well, we're leading because we have people who are direct reports and these stakeholders, aren't direct reports. Well, you and I have talked in the past about John Maxwell's definition of leadership. And he says that if you have to boil it down to one word, if you have to get down to one word, it's influence. And we think about all the people we have to influence when we're running projects. I mean, it's not just the boss or the sponsor, but that's true. It's not just the people that are outside the team. It could be outside of our company. It could certainly be our team members. And we have to influence these people in order for our project to be successful. So I think stakeholder management is clearly a topic that we need to wrestle with as leaders. Like, how do we do this well? Because often at the end of the day, they're the people who judge whether our project was successful.
And sometimes that judgment doesn't come out of the realities and the facts, it comes out of their perception.
Yeah, right.
Which kind of
Sure.
gets me to the other one. You and I have both been facilitating workshops for long enough to know that sometimes the material assumes, presumes that our
Mm.
stakeholders are lined up with us. They bought in, they are really supportive of our projects, but let's be real, it doesn't always work that way. So, since we know that there are difficult stakeholders and the people who are listening not only know but might have come from one of those meetings with a
Yeah.
difficult stakeholder, um, what's an idea that they can use to just start with?
Yeah, it's interesting because everyone's situation is unique in the dynamics. But I just had breakfast this morning with a guy who was talking about a company where he's at, and there's just this sense of primarily one stakeholder is like, no, 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 we already tried this before. It's so they're being an obstacle in that they're not open to ideas. So sometimes it's that, but sometimes it's actually a lot more almost like insidious. Where one client told us during an exploratory call that before our project management class that we're going to deliver there, they said we were asking, well, tell us about your culture, and this person said, our culture is kind of like the Hunger Games. Now think about that, the Hunger Games. I mean, that's a little bit like saying you turn your back, right? And there's like arrow coming at you, and yeah, and so it really depends on the situation. But the truth is, we often, for one reason or another, have people that are not as excited, and in fact, to the contrary, they might be against the project for one reason or another. So one of the things I found is that it's helpful to kind of reframe it in our minds when we see a difficult person. Instead of writing them off, our goal is one or two things. It is to win them or to neutralize them. And I don't mean that in the Sopranos or the Game of Thrones sense of neutralizing.
Oh,
Like,
good.
anybody seen Bob? Yeah, no, no, he's swimming with the fishes, right? No, that's not what I'm talking about. But there's something about when you've got a really difficult stakeholder, it's so much easier to write them off. And I think even culturally, if you think about the cultural discussions and debate that goes on, if somebody doesn't agree with you, they're an idiot or they're whatever, and it's easier just to like write our stakeholders off. But there's something about taking it as a challenge to say, I want them as an ally. And I could give you an example of that where a friend who he went from a pretty good project management job to a really good program management job. And he was so excited about this opportunity, more money, prestigious company. But before his first week was done, he had to present to the governance committee, which is made up of senior leaders. And there was one leader in that governance committee, a senior leader, who just rips into my friend. I mean, just rips into him. He's yelling at him. He's swearing at him. It's like, so along the lines of like, can we fire this person? Like, how can you not know the answer? You're an idiot. I mean, it's like one of those things where it would just take you so aback that like, it's my first week. I don't even know where the men's room is, is what my friend kind of felt like saying. But this person was so over the top that it just stunned my friend. And so he tried this advice of, take it as a challenge. Like, what would it take to win this person? And so the second week, he did some homework and he was just trying to learn more about his projects. And in that second update meeting, it's the same thing, Kimmy. He gets ripped into by this same person. And for those listening to us, and I don't know, Kimmy, it's not our first rodeo, so to speak. So this has happened to us before, but you can run into somebody who eventually will shake your confidence. That they just shake our confidence, and they're like, maybe we start feeling, maybe a listener's starting to feel like, man, maybe I'm not as good as I thought, or and this can happen. And so once again, my friend didn't give up quite yet, didn't quit at the end of the second week. He started doing his homework and he asked around and he asked in particular about this difficult person. And the feedback he started giving was like, you had to present to him? Like, yeah. And you lived? Well, barely. And then he started learning more. And as it turns out, this executive treats everybody like that. And he calls it a murder board. And people can look it up. It's it seems like a crazy idea, but the idea is when someone's presenting that you just rip into them. And if anything is left standing after that's kind of scorched earth approach, then maybe we ought to consider that. Which maybe is a good idea in the 1960s, though probably not, but it's a terrible idea in the year 2021 to be treating people like this. It should be a trip to HR when someone treats people like that. And yet, I'm telling you, Kimmy, you know it, I know it, and people listening to us know it. For some reason, companies will sometimes keep people like that. And so we can unfriend on social media, but we can't unfriend a senior leader. Right? We're kind of stuck with them. So the more he learned about this person and his hot buttons and how he likes information presented, things got a little bit better. And my friend was still at the company years later. And so for all I know, the murder board guy got fired, or, I don't know, who knows what happened. But what was cool was he learned that, listen, don't write the guy off. Don't quit. And by the way, I'm not giving any slack for true bullying or true toxic,
Well, that
environment.
wouldn't be like you in the first place.
Yeah, but sometimes I feel like people, and by the way, I'm not judging, but sometimes people I think feel like, but it's a tough economy right now. I got to stay, and so sometimes we end up getting into this really. It feels like we have no choice but to stay within this toxic sort of environment. That friend I had breakfast with this morning, he's new now at a company that it was previously where he left a very toxic environment. And I'll tell you, Kimmy, the breath of fresh air that this friend is living through now because he finally got out of that. So
Yeah.
I'm not giving any slack for truly toxic, but to be quite honest, I think we too easily call people a bully or toxic. And the truth is, well, I'm not saying always, but in some cases, it's just a tough, tough customer. It's a tough stakeholder. And instead of writing them off, let's try to do some of these things of like, what would it take? What would it take? And if we can stay in there, we might find, well, you know what, it's not worth the breath and it's not worth it, let's get out of here. Or we might find, like my friend found, there are ways to kind of make it through.
There absolutely are. But on the way to thinking, okay, you know what, I can deal with this person. I understand the whole murder board concept now, and the reality is we're supposed to be trying to knock off the people who didn't, the problems that
Yeah,
could stop us from being successful. We're not supposed to be knocking our colleagues off their pins.
crazy.
But that happens, but on the way to understanding better, you're gonna have that meeting with that stakeholder, and it can sometimes cause you to just actually, well, it's as if you had too many habanero peppers or something, and I've known a couple of stakeholders who, I won't lie, I couldn't sleep. I would literally schedule them for the beginning of the day because I knew I wouldn't sleep the night before, and I might as well just deal with it while I was still reasonably awake and articulate. But
Yeah.
what I know, you and I already know this. Not only are we not the only people who experience this, every single one of our listeners who has experienced it is going to experience it again. And if you're new to the environment and you haven't experienced it, don't exhale quite yet. It is going to happen. So what would you like the listeners to understand and hear from you that will help them deal with that, because that meeting, it's going to happen.
Yeah. Well, there's a number of things that keep coming to mind. Come to mind. Um, maybe even before the meeting. I feel like sometimes the reason why people are difficult is they feel like we're not listening to them. So they don't feel listened to. And I don't know how you feel, but like sometimes when you don't feel listened to, you keep ramping up the energy and speaking like Kimmy. What I said was, and so I had the opportunity to interview this guy named Tim David, and he's a pretty interesting dude, kind of like a magician, influence expert, and wrote a pretty interesting book on influence. And he said this. He said something. He goes, "People become difficult when their needs are not being met." So just like as a banner over this. So this is all before the meetings. As we think about this person, they're being difficult because their needs are not being met. Now he goes further and says that when in doubt, assume their needs are to feel listened to, appreciated, and loved. Now, the reason why I think this is interesting is I'm not maybe too worried. Maybe the people listening to us aren't too worried about loving that person, but it's this listening idea. Like, what can we do to make sure that they're being listened to? And I don't know about you, but whether it's in that meeting that you're talking about or before the meeting, I think it's easy just to not listen. I mean, we've kind of got our preconceived notion of what someone is thinking, and maybe we've written them off like, oh, they're just some I see is like, well, they're just they're just an old timer. They don't want to understand new technology, or they're not willing to, and we just write them off. But the idea of the listening to them is, especially when it's kind of heated. And I had an opportunity to have one of these discussions just within the last week or so. And it would have just been so easy when this person's just going on and on. It'd just be so easy to go like, oh, look at the time. or, like, I don't know what you do, Kimmy, when someone's ranting or whatever, but it's just really easy to, to kind of, start kind of looking around. But uh, you and I have had this conversation before, but a guy named Mark Goulston, a clinical psychiatrist, he says it this way. He goes, when someone's ranting or going on with their concerns, his his advice is to stare at their left eye, and it's
Okay,
great.
wait,
It's
wait.
great. Yeah,
Left eye. Okay. Really?
yeah, yeah. So we're it's actually a crazy book. It's the title is Talking to Crazy, which is a funny title. Yeah, it's like when you're talking to somebody who to you they seem like certifiably irrational. And in the workplace, I suppose that can happen, but most people are not certifiably irrational in the workplace, but we write them off as that. And he says it's not perfect science that the left eye is tied to the right brain, but the real power to it is keeping the eye contact. And he gives the metaphor of fishing. Like if you get a real, I was talking to a nephew he was ice fishing just earlier this month and got a really big northern. And I was asking what was it like, and they got the fish on the line. They let the fish kind of get tired out, and then it was easier to kind of bring this really big fish in. And Mark uses that metaphor, like let your fish get tired out, which is to say, just let them run a little bit and stare at their left eye. And I found no discernible difference between left eye and right eye. So I'm not, yeah, I haven't found a difference there. But Kimmy, as crazy as this sounds, it's a rare week that I don't use it. And it might be a work sort of thing, which, since most of us have been remote for a while here, that's the equivalent of like staring into the camera. But it might be with my wife, it might be with their kids, it might be with some friends. But the point is that eye contact is a gift. And I know that this can vary by culture, but at least for a lot of the people listening to us, we we need to keep that eye contact, because if they see that we're being distracted, it's going to be very easy for them not to feel listened to. So as crazy as that sounds, and I've had the opportunity to work with people on every continent except Antarctica with that piece of advice, and no one has gotten back to me and said they got fired. Okay, so tailor it to the culture,
Mhm.
but the point is that what if part of it is they just don't feel listened to? And so that's that we can't control that, but we can at least control, are we listening? Yeah. So that'd be maybe before the meeting. So how about this as you're going into that meeting you're talking about? Because I think most people listening to us can envision a meeting that they've they have maybe actually coming up, and it's like, I'm dreading this meeting. These people, this person, I'm gonna look like an idiot. I mean, we I think Kimmy, you and I have met most of our listeners' worst critic. If we know them, that it's them, right? It's
Yeah.
like we are our own worst critic. And later this week, I'm interviewing a guy who wrote a book called Chatter, and it's how to control the mind game. I can't wait to have the conversation, because we are our own worst enemy with the chatter that goes on. So Amy Cuddy, the Harvard professor who's best known for the superhero pose, that if every day you do the superhero pose in the mirror, you feel more confident. Um, During the interview, I asked her about these sorts of meetings. Like, if you have to go into a meeting, I mean, she got a lot of critics over that whole superhero thing,
Oh,
and
yeah.
so like, how do you deal with that? And she goes, well, you can do some superhero poses, and maybe, but she goes, another thing has to do with that chatter, the how you speak to yourself. And she says there's a remarkable amount of research on affirmations of how we speak to ourselves. And I've talked to people that have a specific affirmation that they read or recite every morning. That's part of what they do. And she goes, here's one that does not work. And that is, I'm smart, I'm good looking, and people like me. She goes, that's not going to work too
Okay.
well. Yeah,
Nuts.
even though that's
I
even though
kept
that's true for you. Yeah, that'll probably break down when we're in the presence of the dragon, But she goes, an affirmation that could work for project managers would be something along the lines of this: I know this project. I've done my homework on this project. This project is good for our company. Someone in this company thought I was worthy of doing this. They put me in this position. I'm responsible for doing this. Really, what it comes down to is speak truth to yourself. And I have found that that's helpful advice going into the meeting, because sometimes what we do is we start believing these other people's stories, or we start doubting ourselves. But it's like, wait, wait, wait. All right. They will ask a question and I won't know the answer. That's okay. I can get the answer. And this project is good. I've done my homework. I deserve to have a seat at the table. So she's saying, win the game between the ears, right? Win the game of how you speak to yourself, and that can make a big difference. One last idea on that one about the meeting is, in his book Good Guys, it's how men can be better allies for women. They bring up a point. I'd never heard this term before, but they call it centering. That a lot of times in meetings, we think of the end of the long table as the power position, but it goes in a lot of corporate meetings in a conference room, which hopefully we'll be back in conference room soon. But that people tend to center. That the power tends to be around the center of the table, not the ends of the table, and men ought too often will be right there at the center. And so one of their ideas is invite women into the center, so it's not just there. Or women listening to us, invite yourself into there. I mean, take that step. And this comes from a guy named Dr. Nick Morgan, who also said, if you've got a really difficult stakeholder, instead of sitting on the opposite side of the table or down, way far away because you can't stand to be within their zip code, that go and sit right next to them. So remember the whole centering thing. To me, it's so helpful to have the vocabulary, because once I learned the term, I see it all the time now. And so be aware of the whole centering thing. But for us, proactively, even if we don't get invited, so to speak, to that center, it's like, go sit down right next to that really difficult person. And the idea is, you're at the least you're showing you're not afraid of them, and that the closer you are, people act differently. When we're sitting together at a table, have had lunch together. It's different than if you and I were just doing Zoom, or if we're just on a phone call. It's different when you're with people, and if you can get right next to the person. Dr. Nick Morgan in his book Power Cues recommends this. You'll sit down right next to them. If nothing else, you're showing you're not afraid, and chances are, if you're a little uncomfortable, maybe they're a little uncomfortable with that too. But it's just it's if you're sitting across the table, it's kind of a us versus me versus you, where right next to it's more of a we. And so just a couple ideas there for a meeting.
I think that that's probably really important. I remember when I first got my very first and, I was scared to death, supervisory position. One of the best bits of advice I ever got was, "You're gonna have to give hard news to one of your employees at least once or twice a quarter,
Yeah.
and when you do that, do not hide behind your desk.
Mhm.
Have 2 seats in front of your desk, invite them into the office, come around your desk and sit there right with them, because hard news doesn't mean we're not a team anymore. Hard news means we've just got something we need to work on, and you wanna demonstrate that it's more of a partnership than, as you put it, an adversarial thing. Um, you know, I think that one of the points that you made is you use this phrase, "Do your homework,"
Mhm.
and, Antonio Nieto Rodriguez, who is one of our other speakers, but who's also, referred to and refers to himself as the project manager's champion, says that part of that homework that's gonna really make the professionals in our profession, in our
Yeah.
professional community, even more valuable, is to articulate their understanding of why this project is so important to the organization's overall
Yeah.
strategy. He
Yeah.
says you have to school yourself on that. And so when you say, I've done my homework, I always think part of that homework is articulating to them almost what they told you
Mhm.
when they chartered the project.
Yeah, yeah, that's really good advice. I think too often what happens for us is, or it could be even for executives, it could be one of those things where we've thought through options, we've considered the business case, the trade-offs, and we come to a conclusion, but we don't communicate the why to other people. So then we're trying to roll it out, and people are like, what's that? They don't know the why. So sometimes I think you bring up a really good point, Kimmy, that sometimes people are difficult stakeholders because they don't get the why. They don't understand why are we doing this. And Dr. Robert Cialdini, known as the Godfather of Influence, he has an interesting point about this in his book Influence. He'll have a more articulate way of saying it, but basically it comes down to people want to know the why, and if they know the why, they're more likely to comply is kind of
Ooh,
along the lines of what it says. And now, as obvious as that sounds when it comes off my lips, I think too often it's very easy to not do it or not do it in the context of from the context of the listener, and it's not necessarily clear. And I'm sure everyone listening to us has heard of the WIFM, making sure it's clear what's in it for me. So when you're communicating that difficult news once a quarter, like you're saying, it's help them understand that we're not just trying to, rebuke them or make them feel bad. Here's the why we're giving them this sort of feedback. Or if we're doing this with stakeholders, like what's in it for them? But one of the countless number of mistakes I've made over the years, and this one was a memorable one because I can still feel the shoe in my butt from it. But this was I think I was a director at this point. I might have been a manager, but regardless, I was in a management position, and I knew the guy about two levels up above me who was making some decisions, and I felt like he wasn't making the whiff clear. So Kimmy, he should make the whiff clear. I'm sure I just read it, or he should do that. So I
oh
got on his
no.
calendar. Yeah. And his name was Bob, as it turns out. But I'm like, Bob, I feel you're not making the what's in it for me clear. And I hope to never forget what he said, Kimmy, because this is what he said. Andy, sometimes it's not about you. Ouch. Sometimes it's about what's in it for us. And it
Ah,
stung at the time, but I got to tell you, that was helpful leadership advice for me, because there's going to be some time whether I'm having that conversation like you just talked about with a direct report, giving them some feedback that they're not going to be excited about, and maybe there's not a whole lot in it for them, but what's in it for us at least? Can we say why are we doing? What's the big picture? What's the context? And I'm not going to say it's magically going to make difficult stakeholders become puppies, but I have found that when people really understand the reason why, then it's not I am against you or we're against you. There's some reason, that maybe wasn't obvious up front, and maybe they won't agree with the reason. But interestingly, Chaldean's research found it doesn't have to be that good of a why. It just has to be a why. People want to know the why. And as Brene Brown says, in the absence of data, we make up stories. And so if they don't know, they're just going to be making up stories. And we want to control that narrative by helping them understand what is the why? Why are we doing this?
I think that's important in part because my personal nightmare was I
Yeah.
had done a lot of things. As a matter of fact, I believe I'd even called on you and said, Andy, I've got this and this. And I've tried all these things, and you gave me some counsel, and I went back and honestly, she was still blocking it.
Yeah.
So, what do you recommend at that point? Because
Yeah.
you and I talked, and I got through it mostly because as it happened, she was preparing to leave. Turns out that was one of the reasons why she was being completely obstreperous. How's that for a
Mm,
50-cent word?
yeah. I like
Um,
it.
but everybody's going to run into someone at some point where, for good or for ill,
Mm,
they're still holding back. They're actually actively harming the project now.
mm.
What do you recommend?
Yep. Hitman. No, no. Actually, that will not.
You
That's a really, really bad idea. Edit that out. No, it's just kidding. But it's I think what happens is eventually what we need to do if the person truly continues to block is we need to escalate, and we need to escalate. But something that I learned from Alan Cohen, he wrote a book called uh, Influence Without Authority is the name of the book. And one of the things he says is escalate when you need to, but don't blindside someone, which I I think is really helpful advice, because the idea of blindside is that something they're getting in the way and we're going to go run to mommy or daddy and then tell on our siblings, so to speak. And then the idea is usually if you tell on a sibling, so to speak, it's not going to turn out well. So it might be something along the lines of, well, you know, let's say it's a Bob, right? So, all right, so Bob, I know we've tried a number of different things. I know you're still not excited about this. You're still have concerns. You're still not willing to sign off, whatever it is. This isn't on the critical path. It's delaying the project. So I do need to escalate this. Do you want to come with me to the meeting? Do you want to, is there anything you want to make sure I represent when I go and have those conversations? So the idea is that you're not blindsiding it. And I don't remember if you and I talked about this before, but it was a guy from Microsoft that was in a class, and he said he and a colleague were at this place that you just teed up. It was a situation where they could not find a way to agree, and it was trying to stop the project. So they were going to escalate, but what they did was they flipped positions, and one of them wrote the position paper for the other person's position, and likewise. And so if it was you and me, I would write the position paper for why your approach is what we should take. And you would do it the same thing, even though that wasn't our position, and then presented it to the senior leader. Now, oh my goodness, is that like such a mature sort of way of doing it? And they tried. And the guy, I pressed him on this, as best I can tell, they were genuinely trying to represent the other person's position. Like before it got shown to the boss, they got to read it and go, yeah, that's pretty close to my position. Maybe change a couple things here. But just think of the maturity of that and how different that is from the typical backstabbing or, only look, cherry picking the data that would support my position and trying to make them look bad. So, whether you do it that way, I rarely see what those guys represented in their position, but sometimes you have to escalate. But don't blindside, because if you blindside someone, it's probably going to make it worse. But let's not start with the escalation unless it's such a timely thing and it's that critical. But if none of this other stuff works, we have to escalate.
I was talking to John Quigley, who is the vice president over at NXP, and he said, what frequently happens, and this speaks to exactly what you were talking about, is that people not only don't feel heard, but they feel actually rather horribly belittled
Yeah.
because they're not even important enough to be heard. And when I
Mhm.
asked him, I said, all right, John, I promise people something to go forward with, something they can act upon right now. I said, what is your one recommendation? And he looked at me and he said, listen. Because that flipping of positions means you have to now listen to
Yeah.
parts of the conversation that maybe you messed up the first chance. And that is actually a terrific practice that some friends of mine who are in law enforcement do in order to be sure that they're not allowing confirmation bias to kick in, which is that fancy way of saying, I know what I know, and therefore I'm not going to look for anything that that doesn't line up with this. And you know John kind of echoed your point where he said, listen for the things that will surprise you,
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. And then
and it
then
might,
you can get, yeah, then you can understand, like, oh, Andy keeps using these certain words. Then you can call back to those certain words, right? There, like, there's almost like no downside to listening, because listening doesn't mean you have to agree with them, right? But you're just trying to, like, oh, okay, maybe their position's a little more nuanced here than what I thought. But if we don't listen, we'll never get there. So John's advice, I love how you share that story. That's a good one.
well, one of the things that I know I learned how to actually facilitate on this topic from auditing one of your classes. So, and I use it very frequently, is when we get to level 3 listening and using listening to build rapport with people so that we can better understand what it is they're looking for at that point. You
Mhm.
also have to listen for what they're not saying.
That's a good point. It's so easy not to. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah.
No, wait a minute. You're the one that told me that.
Well, I forget things, but honestly, that's an easy one for me to forget. That I I think I just fill in with my assumptions. So this guy named Peter Boghossian wrote this fascinating book called How to Have Impossible Conversations, and
Oh, that
sometimes
I have to get.
oh yeah, it's definitely worth it. I mean, he's got a chapter on conversation that's worth the price of the book. But he makes a statement, and I think this is a direct quote, but if it's not, it's really, really close. He goes, if you have to make assumptions about someone's intentions, assume only one, that it's better than you think. And so I find that to be really helpful because with difficult stakeholders, it's very easy to not do that. It's so much easier to assume evil intent or that they're an idiot or they're unwilling to change or whatever it is. But he's like, assume only one thing, that their intentions are better than what you think, which goes back to your point then that we've both been talking about is well, let's not assume their intention. Let's talk about it. What try to have a conversation and truly listen and really want to win them. And by the way, win them maybe isn't even possible, but the idea of that neutralize is
Yeah.
maybe they're not a raving advocate, but they're just not as much of a detractor. And sometimes that's enough of a win right there, because we can get progress.
I think part of that win, though, which I is fascinating and is a key element to why this is so important to leadership, is because you're not going to be able to get everybody onto, into your wagon.
Mhm.
But if enough people see that progress includes a person who's been really vocal in
Mhm.
opposition, calming down and chilling
Yes.
out, that
Right.
actually is a huge effective communication tool. And you ignore the impact it could make at your peril, because there might be somebody else who's just looking to that individual for cues. And when they
Yeah.
see them back off and kind of relax, they might not be your biggest cheerleaders ever in life, but that's fine. But when
Yeah.
the people who trust them see that their concerns have been addressed and met, even if the only thing we can say, because sometimes that is the only thing we can say, is I think I have a better understanding of what you're saying. Here's what I believe you said your concerns were. Get agreement on that, and then sometimes the best thing we can offer them is, I see where you're standing on this. I understand where you're standing on this at this point in time within this project. We can't do anything about that right now.
Mhm.
But
Right.
now that
Right.
we know, we can
Yeah.
certainly take that intelligence forward with other efforts that are coming down the pike. Um,
Mm.
so I think this has been incredibly helpful and instructive. And besides, despite all the years we've known each other, it's not often I get to remind you that you taught me
Right.
something.
Yeah. Well, you know what? That's the great thing about friendship is, you have enough conversations that you can't remember whose idea, and it doesn't matter, right? It just if it's a good idea, it's a good idea. So yeah.
It's also a great way to close this out, because
Mhm.
what I'd like to do, first of all, is thank you, because the way that you manage expectations and truly are conscious and present when you do communications. Nobody's perfect, but I've seen you hit the mark an awful lot. And it's helpful to know that, number one, there is a method to the madness, and the steps that you discussed are wonderful and immediately applicable. But more than that, understanding that it's a process and a journey. It's not that you're going to turn around one day and everybody in your stakeholder community is going to be wonderful and they're going to
Right.
love you and you're never
Right.
going to make mistakes. And so there's a lot of humanity in the whole act of communications, but you have to truly be present there and give serious consideration and thought to it. And I think that's one of the things that you always demonstrate. It's your leadership style tends to be very strong on leading by example. And for that, those of us who learn from you would like to thank you.
Well, Kimmy, that's so sweet of you. And maybe when you sound sincere if I say this, but the reason why it's so easy to have you as a friend is I know that's who you are and who we both aspire to be. And so it's inspiring to me to be around people like that. And for those who are listening, follow Kimmy online. Follow Kimmy. You're gonna get a lot of that. I'm telling you. And
Yeah.
it's such a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me to your summit. It's a great thing you're putting on here.
Well, I am jazzed about it. And this is for the next generation, for the generation that isn't done yet, and still
There you
learning.
go.
So thank you very much, Andy, for your time.
Truly my pleasure. Thanks.